Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program, Democracy and Risks to the 2024 Elections. This is part of the Hammer Forum series, and the Hammer Forum is a monthly series of political discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from the Rosenblum Family Foundation. I also want to thank our co-presenter, the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA Law. Tonight's discussion will consider the upcoming November election and the risks posed against it, including concerns of foreign interference, deep fakes, and disinformation. Before we dive into tonight's discussion, I want to highlight a few upcoming programs we have planned. On Wednesday, September 15th, we are screening a new documentary about, wait, is that the right date? Wednesday, September 15th? Team. Sorry, Wednesday, September 25th. We're screening a new documentary about the origins and the future of the Electoral College in the United States. It's a film called One Person, One Vote. And then on Tuesday, October 8th, we have a Hammer Forum called the United States Electoral College and Fair Elections, with a panel of election experts talking about the Electoral College. Also, you might be interested on Tuesday, October 1st, we're going to have a live screening of the vice presidential debate here in the Billy Wilder Theater. So I do hope that you may be able to join us for some of these events. And there's lots of other great programs coming up, so please check out our website for more information, or if you'd like to stay updated, you can sign up to get our weekly email newsletter that sends you the upcoming week's public programs. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests for tonight's conversation, Rick Hasen, Leah Aden, John Fortier, and Yoel Roth. Unfortunately, Justin Levitt is not able to join us tonight as planned due to illness. Leah Aden currently serves as senior counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where she previously served as the deputy director of litigation. Part of her role includes the planning, strategy, and supervision of the NAACP's voting rights work, addressing racially discriminatory vote dilution and voter denial schemes. John Fortier is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Congress and elections, election administration, election demographics, voting and absentee voting, the U.S. presidency, and the Electoral College. Yoel Roth spent 7 years working at Twitter, where he built and led teams for content moderation, integrity, and election security efforts. His research, teaching, and writing focus on trustworthy governance approaches for social media, AI, and other emerging technologies are comprised in a field I never knew existed called trust and safety. He's now the vice president of trust and safety at the parent company of Tinder, Hinge, and more than a dozen other dating apps. He's also a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. Our moderator this evening is Rick Hasen. He's a professor of law and political science here at UCLA and director of the UCLA Law School's Safeguarding Democracy Project. Hasen is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation and co-author of the leading case books in election law and remedies. After tonight's discussion, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments in the lobby. So now please join me in welcoming Leah Aden, John Fortier, Yoel Roth, and Rick Hasen.
Good evening, everybody. Good to be with you again. I'm Rick Hasen of UCLA School of Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. As you heard, Justin Levitt was unable to be with us tonight, but we're going to try and pick up the slack and talk about what are the risks and the challenges and the opportunities that we face as we enter into this election season. And so I want to open up by first turning to you, John. Let me get my questions open here. And just to set the stage, I think the 2020 election featured some challenges that were new. For a long time, we've seen Democrats and Republicans fighting over election rules. We've seen lots of litigation. We've seen allegations of fraud and voter suppression. Um, but the 2020 election, for the first time in the modern period, I think, raised questions about whether we would have a peaceful transition of power. And so I was hoping you could set the stage for us. What did we see in 2020? Can we hold a fair election in the United States this November? What's different this time compared to last time?
Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for coming. I actually like this question because I get to be the optimist, or I'm more optimistic than many people are. It's easy to sort of wring your hands about things, and look, we're a big country with a lot of diversity and different ways we run elections. So of course, no election is perfect, but I think there's some reasons to think that 2020 was very different, and we'll do better here. And B, just that there's some things in the system that I think we should remind ourselves of. So first, we've really improved our elections since the year 2000. And those of you old enough to remember Bush v. Gore, and that was not a good time. And we had a very, very close election, closer than our more recent ones. And of course, being that close, we exposed a lot of issues in our voting system. But if you look at what we did since then, I mean, we've made some major changes in voting technology, not always in a straight line. We've kind of gotten where we need to get indirectly. One big thing I think we will say is both we have more modern and tested machines, but we also have most most machines, and almost everyone, not all, but almost everyone is now voting on a machine that has a paper backup. And there are all sorts of maybe you could say conspiracy theories, or people who think maybe too much of paper and worry about machines. But this move to having this paper backup is a real comfort for people who would worry about an election, to think, there is something there. There are ways to audit. There are ways to go back to the original ballots that are cast by people, and I think that's a big change. We've also dramatically improved our registration systems. We have provisional ballots. I could go down the list, but as much as we complain, our system has come a long way in 20 plus years. Second, we should remind ourselves of how unusual 2020 was. We were running an election during a pandemic. And of course, that's difficult, and we had challenges that everyone faced. But of course, it heightened the political challenges. And the one thing I will say is, I think we could say in good faith, there were big differences as to how we should vote. They reflected some of our differences about what was safe in the pandemic, whether it was safe to go out or we should be voting more in person. And there were all sorts of things that came about. And there were lots of last minute changes, understandably. How do we run this election under these conditions? And those last minute changes caused people to be more suspicious, caused political disputes, sometimes caused our institutions to take longer, or to stumble a little bit in counting the vote. I mean, overall, I think we did a very good job of getting through that election with all these problems, but they were the conditions for a terrible, terrible kind of political raising up of the political conflicts that we already had. Third, I guess my optimism is it depends on how close things are. And I know there are arguments that people may distrust the election no matter what, and I think that's true, but I do think the type of election you have and how close it is matters. We've had two pretty close elections in 2016-20. I would say not so close that we really are arguing over every little vote in a recount as to who won. That was the 2000 election, where we were really on the razor's edge. But even so, one could imagine a pretty close election where the winner wins. The closest state is 1% of the popular vote. It's not dependent on one state. It might just easily fall in that category. And I think that would be an easier election to get through than 2020. And lastly, and Rick pointed this out in some recent articles and some interviews, so I'll kind of echo what he said. Certainly, our mechanisms after the people vote. Actually, I have a book on the Electoral College called "After the People Vote," so I'll do a little promotion. The changes that we've made in law as to how we count ballots, how we count the electors, and how January 6th went run. They're not perfect. I don't think any law would be able to cabin all controversy, but I think there are a lot of reasons why that law is better, and B, even with all of the problems of 2020, which were many, some of the institutions didn't go as far as people wanted them to. And I think there's some comfort in that, that we are not going to get to the more uh, extreme types of situations that we saw in 2020. So basically, I'm an optimist relative to 2020.
Well, that's good to hear, and that'll be the end of the optimism for today, but thank you for that. I'm going to want to come back to you in a few minutes after I have a chance to ask other panelists some questions to dig down a little bit more on the changes to the Electoral College rules, to dig down on the role of the Supreme Court and the courts generally. All of that is, I would say, is kind of a news story about how our elections are run. I want to come to Leah for an old story, which is the story of minority voters having a harder time voting. This is not something that we have to look very far back in American history. I mean, American history has been a history of fighting over the franchise of who gets to vote. And I think it's fair to say that even that John is right, that for many people, voting in this country is very easy. It's not true for everyone. And what your voting rights are depends a lot on what state you live in. We don't have a U.S. Constitution that guarantees beyond a very low floor a certain amount of voting rights for everyone. We really depend on states. So can you tell us, what is the state of minority voting rights in this country? What's different in 2024 compared to 2020 and earlier elections, particularly as it relates to minority groups?
Great. And thank you, Rick, for having me on the panel, and to Claudia and Shannon and the team at the Hammer for making it possible for me to be here. This is a topic that I think about all the time, and we have to begin by asking, what does it mean to have equal opportunity to participate? And for me, that answer is, does everyone have access without significant burdens to freely vote in all phases of the political process? And the short answer is that for Black and other minority voters, the answer is no. At every phase of the political process, there is not equal opportunity to participate. So when we think about voting, there is the question of who is eligible to vote. And depending upon the rules of where you live, you can be incarcerated with a felony conviction, and you can vote while incarcerated if you live in some place like Maine and Vermont. But if you live in a place like Florida, you are ineligible to vote until you pay all of the monetary costs that are associated with your criminal conviction. And sometimes that means that you are disenfranchised indefinitely. So who is eligible to vote in this country determines equality of opportunity. Similarly, if anyone's been watching the news, you know that your eligibility is not a given, and you have to continuously watch out for people who use non-credible information to try to purge you from the voter rolls, particularly close to the election. So equality of opportunity depends upon eligibility and access to eligibility. Then there's the phase of voting that is, do you have what you need in order to be able to cast a ballot? And depending upon the rules of where you live, you might be subject to a strict photo ID law that allows people with concealed handgun licenses to vote, but you cannot use federal or tribal IDs, student IDs, government-issued IDs to vote. And so they're tailoring what you need in order to cast a ballot. Similarly, you might live in a place with widespread access to absentee voting. You might have access to early voting, drop boxes. I saw a drop box right outside of near post office here in LA. You might have all of these abilities to vote. You might have plenty of polling places. You have notice of those polling places. They don't change without you knowing about them. And depending upon the rules, you may have severe limitations on that, and that impacts access to the political process. And then finally, when you think about your vote, even if you cast it, you have to consider in this country that depending upon where you're casting your ballot and what the structure is, you may or may not have a vote that has the same meaning as your neighbors or as other members of the electorate, because people have used race or partisanship to draw legislative or congressional or local bodies, and they have packed you or cracked you into too few districts so that your voice and your vote has less power than that of your neighbor. And in this moment, you have to look at all phases, and you also have to look at the fact that at this point, besides people with felony convictions, and there are millions of them across the country, we're not looking at wholesale disenfranchisement. We're looking at schemes that chip away at all phases of the political process to tailor who the electorate is, and to do so in a way that seems race neutral. It seems that like it's applicable to everybody, but it impacts certain groups together and collectively. We are, of course, in a better place today than we were before 1965 when we didn't have the Voting Rights Act, but we know that the Supreme Court has allowed challenges to the Voting Rights Act that have restricted the power that it has to get ahead of discrimination. Congress has had opportunities to pass electoral reform with the Freedom to Vote Act. And so all of these state restrictions can be addressed by federal legislation and state legislation, but there has been a lack of political will that sometimes is tethered to the way that these structures are in place to allow people in office who are not responsive to the needs of their constituency. And there are these major electoral reforms that are needed in order to get at the schemes that happen at every phase of the political process to deny equality of opportunity, particularly for Black, Latino, Native American, and other voters. So there's a lot of work to do. Going into the 2024 elections, things are different in the sense that there is this refrain that Black and Latino and other voters are committing voter fraud, and it's largely unsubstantiated. And in fact, it is overwhelmingly unsubstantiated. But I think we're heading into an election where the ruse of voter fraud is sort of at an all-time or more recent high, even though it's been used throughout our history in order to prop up electoral schemes to prevent so-called voter fraud, even when it's not based in evidence. And we're headed into a 2024 election where we think we hear this refrain that there's fraud in the electoral process, and there simply is not. So I think that makes this moment unique. I think this moment is unique also because, again, the federal government could be trying to pass legislation that provides more access to all phases of the political process, and that has not occurred. And finally, we're, to John's point, we are on the other side of a pandemic, but we have now much more expansive opportunities to vote absentee, to vote early, and otherwise, depending upon where you live. And I think all of that, is both reflects that in this country there are places where there are many, many means to vote, and depending upon where you live and how historical and social and economic conditions impact you, there are also serious limitations on who can participate. So it's a whole universe of kind of confusion, a whole universe of opportunity. But we are nowhere where we need to be in ensuring that no matter who you are, no matter your background, no matter where you live, that everyone can access all phases of the political process equally.
I'm going to want to come back to you about this point, especially about the claims of non-citizen voting and what this is meaning for voters in Arizona. So I'll come back to you on that. But before I do, I want to bring in Yoel, and I want to talk a little bit about the information environment. So back in the 2020 election, you were very instrumental in assuring that election disinformation was being, at the very least, monitored and in some cases countered on Twitter. And today, I think we look at X, the successor to Twitter, as and the owner of X, as the main vector for election disinformation in the United States. What do you see as the information environment? We had heard that this was going to be the first AI election. Is that hype? Are we worried about foreign interference like we were before? What do things look like now compared to where they were 4 years ago?
Yeah, when you talk about the cybersecurity or the tech dimensions of an election, there's a bit of a ripped from the headlines quality to all of it that I think can lead to the discussion getting a bit overheated, right? It's like Russia did this, Iran did that, AI this, deepfake that, and I find it helpful to step back a little bit and talk about what the objectives of somebody trying to manipulate the information environment during an election would be. I think there's kind of roughly 6 objectives. The first one is misleading people about the issues. Pew put out a poll recently. 95% of American voters say that there are at least one, if not more, issues that are very important to them in making their decision. So at least if you ask voters, they'll say, it's not a popularity contest. I'm voting on the issues. The economy looms large. Immigration figures into this. If you talk to a political scientist, they'll probably say, well, it's a little bit more complicated. It's never exactly about the issues. It's kind of a popularity contest. But, one goal of a disinformation campaign could be to mislead people about the issues. And we're seeing some risk there, right? We are seeing that one person can go on Facebook and share misleading information about, I don't know, the consumption of pets for food. And all of a sudden, this becomes a major anchor point in national politics and discussions about the election. So there's risk there. Second category is misleading people about the candidates. And I think here, when we started out the 2024 election cycle, I thought that was basically a non-entity because we know who President Biden is and we know who former President Trump is. But now there's a little bit of change. I think voters are still getting to know Vice President Harris. And so, again, there's some possibilities here about introducing, if not disinformation, then at least some degree of confusion about who the candidates are, or at least where one of the candidates stands on a number of the issues. So potentially some questions there. Third objective, mislead people about how to participate in the election. I think of this one as like the 2016 era of disinformation. This is stuff like, if you want to vote for Hillary Clinton, text this number. And, I expect the folks sitting in this room know that you can't vote by text message, but this was a shockingly common thing. And in fact, tens of thousands of people tried to vote by text message in the 2016 election. And so misleading people about how to participate is a voter suppression tactic. And it's something that a bad actor might try to do in the context of an election. Fourth, we saw this in 2020, you could try to scare people away from voting. In 2020, we saw an Iranian campaign, a campaign backed by the Iranian government, that targeted voters in swing states by email, telling them that the Proud Boys would come after them if they showed up to vote. And these types of blatant voter suppression tactics aren't always effective, but they're certainly something that you could use if you're trying to really target those pivotal districts or pivotal states that you think are going to be dispositive in an election cycle. Those are going to be the things that really play out at the last minute, but it's certainly a factor. Fifth, I'm almost done with the list here. Fifth, we could see people targeting voters to try to convince them that they shouldn't participate because it doesn't even matter. This was Russia's major strategy in 2016. It was really to try to convince Democrats that, Hillary wasn't that great a candidate. They shouldn't be enthusiastic about her, that, there's all of these divisions about race issues, and maybe you should just stay home. And so again, in a close election, and I think we can expect that this will be close, maybe that's a factor. And then sixth and finally, after the election, you can either try to preempt the results or discredit the results. And that's the one that I personally am the most worried about. And so those are the risks. But the question is also like, are these concerns founded in the facts as we've observed them today? And we actually have a lot of data on this point. At the start of 2024, we were looking ahead to a year in which billions of people around the world in more than 60 major elections were going to be voting. And we were all talking about how it was going to be overrun with deep fakes and various types of disinformation. And it kind of hasn't happened. And that's not to say that it can't happen or that it won't happen. But, when asked how worried should we be about this, I'll borrow a phrase from Katie Harbath, who used to work on elections at Facebook and is now doing a lot of work talking about election issues globally. She says, panic responsibly. We should worry about this, but we shouldn't freak out. And we shouldn't lose sight of the empirical realities, which are the risks are there. But actually, it turns out that convincing people to believe disinformation is much harder than it looks on the surface. People don't see a meme on Instagram and immediately believe it and then change their voting behavior. It turns out there's no real research that suggests that that happens. And so I'd really encourage folks, like, be mindful of those 6 tactics, think about them, but qualify your concern with a recognition that we haven't yet really seen the AI or the disinformation apocalypse play out the way that a lot of people were expecting it would this year.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to want to come back to you and ask about the what it means if we discount even truthful information. Maybe we discount all information. That creates a different kind of problem. But let me dig a little deeper with each of you now, and let me just let the audience know that we'll come to you for about the last 10, 15 minutes for your own questions, so you can think about what questions you might want to ask. Okay, so John, let's talk more about what happened in 2020 and how it was that there was an attempt at election subversion, trying to turn the election loser into the election winner. The scheme was to make vast allegations of fraud and irregularities based on changes in the rules that were being done because of COVID, to use those as a pretext for having Republican legislatures in states where that Biden had won come up with alternative slates of electors, have those electors be sent into Congress, have the vice president either throw out the votes or have members of Congress throw out the votes, and so basically trying to change the results of the election through a combination of court cases, legislative action, gubernatorial action. It didn't happen. And I think in part it didn't happen because we had Republicans and Democrats in positions of power, judges, election officials, and others, stand up and do the right thing. We can't always count on people doing the right thing. So if you could talk a little bit more specifically, are there safeguards in place that warrant the optimism that you're talking about? And you know, there's always the danger of fighting the last war, right? So today there was, for those of you who are political junkies, in Politico's Playbook, which is a morning newsletter that comes out, there was talk about what could Mike Johnson do if he is the Speaker of the House, and it'll be a new House on January 3rd that will vote on January 6th. So have we done enough to fight the last war, and what do we need to worry about in terms of the new challenges?
Great. Now, after that conversation, I'm not sure that's even Rick Hasen asking me a question here. So now I'm really skeptical. No, I think it's a good question. Now, what I would say happened in 2020, of course, terrible things happened in terms of the violence and people going to Capitol Hill, and I criticized President Trump for lots of things in that area about ginning up support, ginning up enthusiasm and not telling people to go away, and that those are all terrible things. But sort of leaving that aside and focusing on the kind of mechanics of what happens to the Electoral College and what happens with the post-election process. I mean, here I think one of the things that, and I don't want to call it a theory, I think there were sort of several theories, is that they grabbed onto little pieces of sort of half-truths and some old precedents we had and kind of constructed a set of things they were supposed to do. And I do think one thing that was good at the end of the day was that I don't think they really had a plan to figure out how to carry this through to the end. There was sort of well, maybe if we get past this, we'll have the states relook at the election. And the further you got down the road of this crazy set of plans, it was less clear how people were going to go. And lots of institutions did not go along. I agree with Rick. That's relying on people's good faith, but the state legislatures and others didn't fully go along. And I think that's some comfort. What I think is different, a few things. One, I think we are probably going to know about the results of our election and resolve it, the election results that the people vote on, and resolve it more quickly. And here, just without getting into all the details, I can offline pick a bone with Rick as to which states might take longer than others. But I think most of the states will actually resolve their elections more quickly because we're not under COVID, because we're under regular conditions. I actually think the ones that we might watch are probably Arizona and Nevada because of the sheer number of votes they have, and some of they come in late. But still likely we're going to resolve this more quickly. That doesn't mean that somebody couldn't claim that the results are wrong, but I do think the weighting didn't help. All right, the weighting kind of added to the conspiracy theories about that there were reasons for the delay, and I think we're going to resolve things more quickly. When we get to the Electoral College, we have passed a new law. That's helpful. I don't think the law fixes everything, but it does a few things. It makes it harder to object to things in the when we get to January 6th. That's a good thing. I might even go higher than they do. They now 20% of the House, 20% of the Senate. You could imagine a party, getting together and getting that 20%. But again, to really throw out votes, it takes over 50%. And I think it's very hard to hold together those majorities. So I think it's hard. The vice president isn't supposed to be involved. That was pretty clear beforehand. Not that it had never been brought up in the past, but I think that was pretty clear in the Constitution that was the case, but it's been codified in law. And there are some things that we've done that have made it easier to, ensure that we're going to get one slate of electors. We had some bad precedents out there. Some things that didn't matter. If any of you are really into this, you'll follow the 1960 Hawaii precedent, which was, many people had a throwaway, but it sort of allowed some people to think you could kind of come back later and then certify a different set of people as the real electors after the Electoral College had voted. I think those sort of things, we opened up the box to them. We've closed it a bit with the law. So I think it is still very hard to get collective action to do some of these things that people wanted to do. I think the end game, if you want to call it that, really wasn't there. They never really thought out how this theory was going to get them to sort of ultimately change the election results. So I think we're not in a there's nothing that's foolproof. We had an election in 1876, our worst ever, I will say, and we passed the law some number of years after the original electoral count, which people criticize. But eventually, it sort of settled things down, and partly it was luck that we had lots of not close elections, but we had a period of 80 or 90 years where we didn't have any objections in January 6th, and it's only been recently that we've opened this up. So I agree that we could bring out all sorts of other new scenarios that people could get around certain things, but I think you find a lot of them are much more difficult to hold together. What would be almost needing to hold together your whole party controlling two branches of the legislature in order for some of these things to happen.
And just to briefly follow up, I don't know if you saw the remarks from J.D. Vance this week where he said that he would have sent it back to the states. Does that language worry you, or do you think that's just kind of cheap talk that is just maybe playing to the base to try to win an election?
Well, I think it's a little bit of cheap talk, but I think it's also a little bit of confused talk. Because again, I think there was some talk about doing that last time. Maybe we'd have a 10-day relook at the elections back in the states, and then what was going to happen? They were really going to come up with different results, and we were going to vote again. I mean, I think that seemed
was the Ted
pretty
Cruz plan.
Yeah, right, and that seemed pretty unreasonable. And I think other people didn't even have that specific a plan. So I don't think he has anything in mind that what he said there doesn't worry me in terms of specificity or the ability to carry it out.
Does it worry you in terms of rhetoric?
Well, I don't think it's a good thing. I mean, I will say, the one piece of rhetoric, I mean, I think generally speaking, Trump said a lot of things that I wouldn't agree with about the Electoral College and its advisors, others. But I mean, I think for me, the simple point was I didn't have a problem with lots of lawsuits, even if you thought they were frivolous, challenging things up until the moment, either at the safe harbor, but let's just even say the day the Electoral College voted. But once the Electoral College votes, I think we just have to say, we're done. We're done with the talking about what happened in the states. And even if you have questions about it and you want to go reform the law or come back next time, fine. But if you start saying after, I don't remember what day it is this year, the 17th?
December 17th.
17th of December. If after December 17th you are saying we need to keep thinking about what happened in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, I mean, I think that's a good line to draw, that you don't want somebody saying, hey, the election isn't over at the people's level. I think that's the time to stop.
Yeah, it was Lasavita, am I pronouncing his name right?
Chris Lasavita, yeah.
He said it's not over until Inauguration Day. And that seems to me to be a little late in terms of what the calendar is. Leah, let's dig down a little bit into kind of the human costs of these changes in voting rules and confusion. I don't know if since you've been traveling, I don't know if you saw the story today out of Arizona about potentially 100,000 voters who might not be able to vote in state elections now. So just to give a little bit of background on this, the Constitution gives Congress the power to set the rules for congressional elections. And so Congress has passed a law that basically has a form that people can fill out to register to vote. And some states are resistant to accepting this form without additional proof of citizenship, like your birth certificate or a naturalization certificate or a passport, or if you've provided that to the DMV, then you could use your DMV number. And so in Arizona, thanks to a series of lawsuits, including some that went to the Supreme Court, if you vote having filled out this federal form, you are only able to vote in the federal elections in Arizona. And if you vote having filled out the state form and you've provided the documentary proof of citizenship, you can vote in federal and state elections. But going forward, since a Supreme Court ruling about 2 weeks ago, if you register with the state form, you're not registered at all. But if you registered before the Supreme Court's order, you can vote in federal elections only. Confused yet? So today, the Maricopa County recorder, a guy named Stephen Richer, who we've had at our events, I think someone very committed to running free and fair elections, realized that they had made a mistake and had miscoded 100,000 people as who had filled out the state form as having provided documentary proof of citizenship, but they didn't. And so he went to the Supreme Court of the state of Arizona and said, what do I do with these people? Do they get to vote or not? And so I want to ask you, as a litigator, someone who is in the trenches in a way that I'm not, what is it like for voters on the ground, and how do you try to, I remember a story, I think I wrote about this in my Election Meltdown book, about having to print tribal IDs at the last minute in North Dakota so that people wouldn't be disenfranchised. What is this experience like, dealing with voters who face these kinds of, you need a kind of a flow chart to know if you're allowed to vote, when, and how?
So I think globally it's a comment on, depending upon where you live, there are different rules. And there are some people who do not have to jump through hoops to vote. And then there are other people, depending upon where you live, where you have to jump through different hoops, fill out different forms, go find birth certificates and other things to prove who you are. Whereas, when I live in New York, I show up at the voting precinct, I sign my name, they look at it, see if my signature matches, and I get my ballot and I go on my merry way. And so I think it's a comment on a system that fairly allows states to set up their own rules, but when the rules are designed to provide added burdens to particular communities, we have to be skeptical about why that is and have protections in place to prevent that. I think it's also a comment on the fact that, our Supreme Court has oftentimes prevented us from implementing remedies before elections, even when we've had decisions that say that laws they're trying to implement are going to harm voters, because they say we can't change the rules too close to an election. And I think this Arizona case is an example where the Supreme Court issued a decision where the rules were changed really close to an election in a way that is leading to confusion, both on behalf of voters and election administrators, because of outcomes. And so I think it's just a comment on this maze that people have to jump through depending upon who you are. And the maze impacts different people depending upon if you have to work, depending upon when you were born, where you were born, what documents you have. It depends on if you think you're going to be policed for having to justify who you are to an election administration official. It depends upon if you're one of the people who is hearing on the news that certain communities of people commit fraud, and you're like, I just don't want to engage in this process because these rules are being set up in order to potentially criminalize me for participating. So I think it's we just shouldn't have a system where certain people can run towards the finish line to vote without having to jump over hurdles. Where if you live in another place, you have to jump over many, many hurdles to vote. And if you step back and look at it, these hurdles are erected in places where the underlying structures are flawed and or where, it comes down to close elections and people trying to chip away at the electorate and just encourage people to stay home so they don't participate and they can carve out who is going to be part of the electorate and largely carve out it so that it includes people who they think are going to be voting for them. And that just shouldn't be the system that we want, where we want everyone's voices to matter, and however the cookies crumble and whoever makes the best case, that is the person who survives the day. But that's simply not what we're seeing on the ground in places.
Thank you for that. So, Yoel, I want to come back to this question of people figuring out what the truth is. And there's this great article.
Easy question.
There's this great article by Bobby Chesney and Daniel Citron where they coined the term the liar's dividend, which is this idea that when there's, let's say, lots of manipulated videos out there, even when something is true, the liar can claim, oh, that's fake news. So I think Donald Trump literally said that the Access Hollywood tape was fake after he apologized for it. And then people can somehow believe that. But I was thinking about this, not just the liar's dividend, but just more generally, that we have this truth erosion. And so people are discounting truthful information because they don't know whether or not it is true or not. And the kinds of tools, so it's kind of like a natural experiment. If you think about it, in 2020, you at Twitter, you were doing all of the, not you personally, but you all were doing, you were putting on labels, you were, click on this link to learn what's actually happening when there'd be election disinformation. You were promoting certain content, demoting other content in order to give voters the tools so that they can figure out what's going on and vote consistent with their interests. Now, here's the natural experiment. You have the head of X is, not only is he promoting one candidate, he's gotten rid of the trust and safety team, and he is sharing, I think you have to follow Elon Musk if you're on X now. I don't know if you can unsubscribe from him, but he regularly puts out election disinformation. I wonder, does this just create an atmosphere where we just discount everything? And does this tell us anything about whether what you tried to do in 2020 made a difference?
I think there's like 8 questions in there, so I'm going to try to parse them out a little bit. Let's start with the liar's dividend, because this is the one I worry about a lot. I think it's true that we are in an environment where it is harder for most folks observing some conversation or some claim of fact to know if it's true or false or manipulated or doctored or AI generated. And part of that is fed by this hype cycle that we've found ourselves in since the debut of ChatGPT just a couple of years ago. And I think what's interesting here is not actually that the technology of ChatGPT and generative AI has created giant new election threats. I think that hasn't really happened, but we're all talking about it. Let me do a straw poll of the folks in the audience, and then I'll kind of read it back. How many of you in the last week have either read or seen on TV a news story talking about AI? If you could raise your hands. That's 100%. And so I mention this because when we are surrounded pervasively by discussions of this technology and about its power to fabricate audio that sounds like a family member or video that looks like a presidential candidate, you can't help but be more skeptical of everything that you're exposed to and potentially be primed to accept a claim that something is fake, even if it isn't. And if you hear that claim, I believe there is such a thing as truth in the world. There are facts. We live in an observable reality, but it takes time to figure that out. And the dynamics of platforms like X are that these claims, true, false, somewhere in between, can go unbelievably viral and spread to a massive audience, especially when they're propelled by people who have millions of followers, before anybody has a chance to actually suss out what's going on the ground. And so that dynamic worries me a lot. It worries me that we're in a space where virtually everybody is thinking about the possibilities of generative AI to produce non-credible content, and we're worried about it. It worries me that people make these claims in bad faith, and so you see the liar's dividend as a factor. And it worries me that these claims can spread unbelievably quickly, sometimes propelled by people who have a particular partisan interest. And the folks responsible for trying to figure out truth from falsehood here are under-resourced and generally less able to do this work than they have been during previous election cycles. And so for me, that is a concern, and it's one that feels like, there's not a great set of solutions to those dynamics.
Okay, I'm going to do one more quick round with the panel and then come to your questions. I'm going to ask you each the same question, which has two parts. If you could change one small thing and one big thing about how we are conducting our elections or in our election environment in order to improve it, however you define improvement, what would those things be? So this is the kind of the pop quiz lightning round. John, we'll start with you.
Okay, so I'm not sure you'll think my big is one and my small is the other, but I'm going to give you two, and I think the first one's bigger, and I think we think less about it. But I still think the thing that in our elections, because we are so decentralized and we have improved, but that still really needs some work, is our voter registration system. We have 50 states. We've actually improved a lot from 2020 because we used to really be almost, different lists per county across the country. But there's a lot to be done, both in terms of making those lists accurate and inclusive and able to talk to each other across the states. And that doesn't solve all problems, but it is something that underlies a lot of the way our mechanics of voting work. So I was going to call that my big one. My small one is I do think we could do some more to speed up the way in which we count votes. And I think there's a lot of controversy here, or a lot of partisan difference about what some of the solutions are. I think both parties actually have some things right and some things wrong, but there's a variety of things that we could do which would be good. They wouldn't be producing the absolute final results within 2 days, but many states could very easily report their near complete totals of elections in a much quicker way. And again, I think that is not the end all be all, but I do think that we've kind of, with the complexity of our elections and all the things we were doing, we sort of moved away from that. And I could even give you some cases of a very progressive state like Colorado, which does all these things that I think many progressives would like, but also does some things well, and things fit together in a way that they can report things quickly. And a lot of people moving towards very complex systems of elections don't think about these things. And having our results being reported much later than used to be 30 years ago is not a plus in our system.
Leah?
I love this question. And my small and big things are relative. So small things, I would love Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And
Wait, was that the small
That's
thing?
small?
Yes, that's small. And the reason why I say it's small is because Congress could pass the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act in the course of a few years in less than about 50 plus years ago, right? So it's possible. Congress can get itself together and do transformative legislation, and we have drafted it, and it's ready to be passed. So I think it's a small thing that they could do to level set and provide a baseline amount of democracy for all of us. And thank you for the folks who clap. That means that you are encouraging your legislators to support it. So bravo to you. And I think the more lofty goal would be to have truth in education so that people understand the role of the president, but they understand the role of Congress. They understand that the tax assessor, the people who are elected to state court judges, the DAs, they understand what their jobs are and how powerful they are in everyday aspects of our lives, because I think that's missing, and I think it leads both to people instilling themselves in power and making decisions about people's lives without people really understanding their power. And if we had more access to it, I think we would take more seriously and be more potentially engaged in elections for all of these seats of power that, again, impact our lives daily. So that would be my dream aspiration.
Yoel.
It's hard to follow those. The big one, and to end on an optimistic note, I think we're actually starting to see this, is for the folks responsible for election security issues, especially within the government, to be faster and more public with their findings about what's going on. Within the last couple of weeks, we've seen major indictments of folks that are involved in interfering in the elections right now. We've seen cases related to Tenet Media, which was a Russian backed organization that was sponsoring conservative influencers. We've seen the government expose Iranian campaigns targeting this election. And I think we need to see more of that. When I look back at 2016, the great failure when it came to disinformation was that the government knew a whole lot more about what Russia was doing than it told anyone in real time. It was only in 2017, after the election was done, that we all belatedly started to know what was actually happening. And so move faster, be more public, declassify more when you can, pursue these cases publicly when you can. And I think the benefit of that is not only stopping bad actors, but also helping all of us understand what is actually the threat landscape that we're facing. We can deal with the sort of ambiguity of the information environment by filling in the gaps in the information environment and just having more of that knowledge. The small one, and it's small not in terms of the scale of the ambition, but small in terms of, all of us can do it. And it's a bit of a cliche, is think before you share. When we talk about social media, we sometimes think of it as these like faceless machines and algorithms that are controlled by Silicon Valley puppet masters and whatever. I focus on the—
It's not?
Maybe. I guess we can get into that. But, the first word there, social, is the important one. It's us. What's the line about Soylent Green? It's made of people. Facebook, it's made of people. It's all of us. We're producing the content. We have the decisions to make about what we share, what we don't, how we react to inflammatory posts or don't. And especially in these environments where we don't have all of the facts at our disposal, we can be swayed by emotion. And I think all of us can take a bit of personal ownership in these moments when we feel passionately about what's going on in an election to say, you know what? Maybe I don't need to hit send on that comment. Maybe I don't need to repost that, and kind of give everybody a little bit more space to figure out the facts on the ground.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to turn to audience questions, and there are people going around with microphones, which we can't see because we're blinded by the lights that are shining at us.
Thank you for a really interesting panel. It seems to me that the question really is not about truth or fiction, really about what's plausible and implausible. Because once somebody's threshold for what's plausible is either raised or lowered, will dictate how they react to information they get about Jewish space lasers or Hugo Chavez trying to alter the voting machine outcome. So how can we deal with that level of implausibility or plausibility for people who are easily swayed by those suggestions?
I think that's for you, Yoel.
It's hard. And we're in an environment where more and more people are just asking questions. You don't even need to advance a claim. You don't need to sort of plant a flag in the ground and say, I believe this thing that is untrue. You can just say, well, I was asking a question about it. And, when is it wrong to ask questions? I don't know that there's a great solution to that, right? I think one answer is for the folks who do have access to the facts on the ground to keep talking about them. In 2020, the Department of Homeland Security, one of their most successful initiatives was something they called rumor control. And all they were doing was debunking misleading claims about what was actually happening in terms of election security. And what that does is sort of bring facts to meme warfare and just asking questions. And I think that's really all we can do. And there's always going to be the folks who are asking questions. There's always going to be the shifting Overton window of plausibility. But the only thing I can come up with to try to address that is to sort of insistently bring ground truth into the discussion.
Can I weigh in a little? And I think we've been agreeing on lots of things, so I'll try to disagree a little. And this is partly a disagreement with Yoel's earlier point, but it comes to this. You mentioned that it would be better if we just revealed what we knew more quickly and more transparently. I think the worry that we have is, a lot of things that at the federal level that we've passed have been broadly consensus based, or maybe some things couldn't be passed today, but it's hard to get something past election laws. And there, is obviously some give and take, and both sides have some disagreement on what it is. And we have a very decentralized system, and that has some benefits, right? People would say, well, it's hard to fix an election if you have to go to 50 states or 8,000 counties, or that we can have these differences of opinion. The one thing that I worry about and this is the Homeland Security Department, and I think they did a very good job in some respects, but they weren't really authorized by some law directly to play the role that they're playing now. They came about this because they declared elections to be critical infrastructure, and then they have some other powers. And the worry is that the people in those positions, without the guidance of law, without the guidance of this compromise between the parties, or whatever that would be, are going to be weighing in on some of these questions. And so I think some of the problems in 2020, the one that sticks in some people's minds is when, to debunk things, they said this is the most secure election ever. Now that's a very general statement. I wouldn't have made it. It's sort of hard to say what that means. And I know the intent was to reassure people that there weren't these conspiracy theories. And it was Donald Trump's administration, although I will admit, I think it was people who were probably not totally on board with Trump's message and were celebrated as being kind of, going against Trump. But imagine again, you're now an election. Somebody's running for office today. The one administration is in office. Kamala Harris is running. Joe Biden was running. If they're making decisions about some of these debunkings or other things, without the basis of law, that gives a lot of power to the administration running and maybe hurts the party out of power. And the ability to sort of weigh in and debunk these things, I think, is going to have to be done in a very crafted and compromised way. And I think this is a power that's not really well regulated or well defined, and we should be cautious about.
Let me add that something that is probably a little less controversial is, and this is something that John and I were part of an ad hoc committee that issued a set of recommendations through the Safeguarding Democracy Project, that the platforms and traditional media should give access to election officials to be able to share truthful information. So, can you find the LA County election official online and get official information about what's happening with the vote count? Or, can you not tell what's a counterfeit? And so, there had been a lot of work to give, just something as simple as a .gov address to be able to go to a website. Not all election administrators had that. So one way of dealing with the problem of finding accurate information is giving voters tools so that they can more easily differentiate the source of information and to evaluate it. Take another question.
I know you have some confidence, but what worries me, and I wanted your opinion on, is that a political party has gotten the state of Georgia to change the way they look at the way they certify or can make complaints about any election. And how do you feel given a particular candidate who not only is still talking about 2020, but has come out and said that the only way he can lose is if there's fraud? And he has a lot of supporters. And then you have also a Supreme Court that has granted him somewhat immunity and could probably decide. Now, I know you say, well, hopefully we don't have a close election, but what if we do?
Yeah, so beyond the election administrator's prayer, Lord, let this election not be close, what can we rely upon here?
Right. I mean, I guess maybe I should take the first part of your question, and I think I might get some of Rick's support on this one. But in terms of the election certification, I mean, there was an issue, and there were some places in America where local election officials, especially, although it could happen at the state level too, said, "Well, we're just not going to put our stamp on it. We're not going to say this is a certified election." And the thought was, well, maybe that would delay the overall counting, or perhaps cause people to recount. Or again, I'm not sure the end game was totally well thought out there, but it was definitely theoretically a problem. I do think that in these cases, what we've seen, what law is, what places seem to be saying now is that courts are very likely to be able to, if somebody really is that adamant, your courts are likely to step in and just say, look, the deadline has come. You haven't certified. We're just going to certify it for you. So I think that even though this is sort of some talk by some people, it's not well thought out. I don't think that there's a great end game there. I think that sort of avenue is going to be well shut down. So I'll start with the specific.
Leah, do you have thoughts about what's going on in Georgia? You probably have a lot of thoughts. Do you have thoughts about what's going on in Georgia that you'd like to share?
Mostly that is just I ultimately agree that I think it's more goes to creating this atmosphere in advance of elections that there are no structures in place, that it's up to particular individuals to call elections, that there is fraud that they need to be on the lookout for, which is why they should be given this discretion. I mean, I think it's concerning that we're still having these conversations. And frankly, it's buttressed by the fact that we have federal courts, we have judges who have unleashed states and others to get ahead of so-called fraud and to sort of police the election process, even when there's no evidence of it. So I think it's concerning that this is what we're spending our time on, and that we're still grappling with that our elections are safe and secure, and there just simply is not substantiated evidence that there is widespread fraud that people need to be policing. I think it's more a comment on that we have not gotten around that, and it's because at the highest levels of power in our country, people have unleashed people to question the legitimacy of our systems, that should be unacceptable. But that's frankly where we are in our country, and we have not put that genie back in the bottle, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon either.
If I could just follow up, and this is, piggybacks on something that Yoel said about the possibility of some of these messages demobilizing voters. I mean, do you think it's a problem that we do fora like this and talk about these things? Like, I was speaking to a group last night. I said, there are lots of other democracies in the world that have polarized elections, polarized electorates, but they're not fighting about their elections. Like, this is a pretty much a unique American phenomenon. Are we spending too much time thinking about how we run our elections, and is that actually counterproductive?
The only thing I will say no, and partly because I believe in people, and I also particularly believe in Black people. We see in Georgia that despite the disarray around recent elections, people stand in line for 4 and 5 and 6 hours because they understand the stakes of elections and what it means for their lives and their lives of their children. I believe in that. I believe it's worth continuing to fight for an electoral process that allows everyone to vote, and to vote fairly and equally, because we see people willing to make sort of ultimate sacrifices for our democracy because of what it means in their daily lives and the people who they elect. So I think it's worth talking about because it's important, and because without grappling with these issues, we're letting the inevitable happen, which is certain people believe that they know what's best for everybody rather than us make the determination about who we want to represent us and make choices about our lives. The power really isn't ours, and people show up. So I have faith in us ultimately, even amidst the chaos and the disarray.
I'm afraid now we have too many optimists on this panel. But all right. Well, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I have a basic question, and Rick kind of answered it in that you suggested that we have a .gov site for finding out the truth. But that's in the future. What, if anything, can you recommend for a voter today to look up things and be serious about it? And I'll be honest, I throw out Fox News or faux news and look at all the other mainstream media to try to sort out what is valid and what is true.
So
what could you do
just
now?
to rephrase the question a little bit, how should voters be getting reliable information today? And
Well, I mean, there are a lot of ways to answer this question. I'm probably going to answer it more from the election administrator perspective here. But I think one of the things Rick was referring to is, I mean, we do have a decentralized system. We have 50 ways of voting, right? And so it often is very hard at the federal level, or just speaking generally, to say what the law is or what your rules are in a particular state. And I actually think sometimes we fall into this, well, we have to say something really general at the national level. Secretaries of state have a specific program, and I think there's a difficulty with this because many people don't really think, oh, I got to go to my Secretary of State or perhaps my local election official. But I think the point of what Rick's had made and the .gov is that probably is the best source of election as to the mechanics of voting and what the rules are about voting in your state, because it's very different for different places, and they are making an effort to make themselves the trusted sources. So I do think that's the best place and the best way to get there. Question is whether people actually get there and how hard it is, but I think that's a good thing. One other small thing about the .gov is we actually have such a variety of places running elections. We're in LA County, the largest jurisdiction in the country, 10 million people, 6 million voters, bigger than many states. We have towns of 50 people in Maine that run elections under the same rules. And actually some of them didn't even have, they didn't have the .gov because they were using their Gmail or their like non-government email. So that was the other point about this, but it's something to remember again about the diversity of our elections, and going to somebody who knows your rules is important.
Let me ask you, I see a lot of, this is anecdotal, a lot of people complaining that Google search is not very accurate anymore, in part because of the, I don't know if that's Gemini or something else, but that you get this little AI summary now at the beginning.
I hear it tells you to eat rocks and glue, or maybe they fixed that one, but.
But so do you think is it harder with the kind of deterioration of search functions for people to get good information, and what's the short-term thing that people should be doing?
Yeah, one of the miracles of the internet was that for so many years you could pretty reliably go to the first or second result of Google and trust what you saw and get an answer to your question, and it generally was pretty reliable. And while I don't think generative AI per se, whether it's Gemini or anything else, is solely to blame for this, I think it's undeniable that we are all dealing with an erosion of the quality of things that we rely on every single day to get access to facts. We see chatbots lying to people about how to participate in elections because they're trained on data that's 3 years old, and some of that has changed. And then also sometimes they just, make stuff up. So
just like people.
Indeed. But we're primed by years of using Google to think that if the technology says it, it must be true and it's accurate. And so I think we need to go back to some of the information hygiene habits that we've had, which is, you read the AI summary, maybe it's right, maybe it isn't, but do a little bit of digging. If there's those footnotes that point you to a source for one of the claims in the AI summary, might not hurt to click the footnote and, make sure it loads, because sometimes the footnotes are made up. Or if you go to the footnote, see that it actually says the thing that the AI summary says it says. We can all do that, and it takes more time and it's less convenient. But the truth is we are in an eroded information environment where the things we've been able to take for granted for a while, we can't anymore. And I think we can vote with our feet when it comes to the technology that we use and say that we don't want these sort of fabulous, inventing, hallucinating AI products everywhere all the time, and that we aren't interested in it. But given they're there, I think we have a responsibility to just do the digging and make sure that we are taking the time to expose ourselves to the most credible information we can.
I will say 15 years ago, and partly I wrote a weekly column then, and I, at the time, had criticized some Ron Paul people about something. The top 2 Google searches for me were AEI's lying John Fortier. So there we go.
On that note, I want to have you all join me in thanking our panelists for a very elucidating discussion. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.